So today I will be discussing about the chapter 4, which is all about designing meaningful performance-based assessment. So as we'll learn the nature of performance-based assessment, its characteristics, types, advantage, and limitations, the next step is to design it aligned to the learning goals. So after we determine the nature of the performance-based assessment, the next step that we have to focus on is to design it according to the aligned learning goals. So, there are following steps that will guide you in developing a meaningful performance assessment, both process and product that will match to the desired learning outcomes. So, first step is the defining the purpose of assessment. So, this step will help the teacher to easily identify the weaknesses and strengths of the student's performance. So, in this step 2, it also provides information on what the students are needed to perform in a task given. So, purpose must be specified at the beginning of the process so that proper kinds of performance criteria and scoring procedures can be established. So, basic questions which teachers ask in determining possible learning competencies are considered and listed below. So, in defining the purpose, a teacher can consider these following questions. So, what important cognitive skills or attributes do I want my students to develop? What social and affective skills or attributes do I want my students to develop? What metacognitive skills do I want my students to develop, and so on and so forth. So these are the following questions that a teacher should really consider in defining the purpose of assessment. So, in defining the purpose of assessment, there are learning targets that must be carefully identified and taken into considerations. So, according to Macmillan in 2007, there are 4 types of learning targets which are deep understanding, reasoning, skills, and products. So, these 4 types of learning targets are used in a performance assessment. So, first we have deep understanding. So, the essence of performance assessment includes the development of students' deep understanding. So, the idea of this type of learning targets is to involve students meaningfully in hands-on activities for extended periods of time so that their understanding is rich and more extensive than what can be attained by more conventional instruction and traditional paper and pencil assessment. So this type of learning targets aims to enrich a student's understanding over a particular topic. So next we have reasoning. So reasoning is essential with performance assessment as the students demonstrate skills and construct products. So typically, students are given a problem to solve or are asked to make a decision or other outcome such as letter to the editor or school newsletter based on information that is provided. So another thing that or another learning targets that could be targeted by the teacher is the reasoning skills to enhance the students to demonstrate their skills and to construct their products. Next, we have skills. So, in addition to logical and reasoning skills, students are required to demonstrate communication, presentation, and psychomotor skills. So, lastly, we have products. So, products refers to the compiled or the completed works such as term papers, projects, and other written works of the students that can be used to measure their knowledge and skills. Next, we have this 1.2 process and product-oriented performance-based assessments. So, in defining the purpose of assessment, the teacher should identify whether the students will have to demonstrate a process or a product. So, during the assessment or during defining the purpose of assessment, a teacher should always specify or determine whether the students is to demonstrate a process or a product in order to um to fully aware the students on what they really need to do. So learning targets which require students to demonstrate process includes the procedure of proper handling, manipulating of microscope, or steps to be done when an earthquake drill. So those are an example of process and product oriented performance based. So we have here some other examples for English grade 7, Filipino grade 7. Those are some other examples of specifying uh, whether a student is to perform or to demonstrate a process or a product. So the next step in designing a meaningful performance-based assessment is identifying performance tasks. So having a clear understanding of the purpose of assessment, the next step is to identify performance tasks which measures the learning target you are about to assess. Some targets imply that a task should be structured, others require unstructured tasks. So, in designing a task, these following questions should be taken into consideration or should be answered. So, for example, what ranges of tasks do the learning targets imply? Which parts of the task should be structured and to what degree? Does each task require students to perform all the important elements implied by the learning targets? Do the tasks allow me to assess the achievement dimensions I need to assess? What must I tell them about the task and its scoring to communicate to them what they need to perform, and will students need with different ethnic and social backgrounds interpret my task appropriately? So those are the following questions that are needed to be taken into considerations in um identifying the performance task which measures to the learning target that you are about to assess. So it is really important to ensure that your learning target and your performance tasks will match or will meet each other. So in giving a description of the task, it should include these following elements such as the content and skills targets to be assessed, description of the students' activities, is it groupings or individuals, what help can they have or can they get from other people, or the help that is allowed, the resources needed, the role of a teacher in that particular assessment, administrative process, and scoring procedures. So those are the following elements that are needed to be included in describing a task in order to fully aware the students on what task and criteria do they need to perform. So, according to Lin in 1995, there are suggested ways to improve the development of tasks. So, he suggested this following. First is on focus on learning outcomes that require complex cognitive skills and student performance. So tasks need to be developed or selected in light of important learning outcomes. Since performance-based tasks generally require a substantial investment of student time, they should be used primarily to assess learning outcomes that are not adequately measured by less time-consuming approaches. Next, select or develop tasks that represent both the content and the skills that are central to important learning outcomes. Minimize the difference of tasks, performance, and skills that are irrelevant to the intended purpose of the assessment task. Provide the necessary scaffolding for students to be able to understand the task and what is expected. Construct task directions so the student's task is clearly indicated, and clearly communicate performance expectations in terms of the criteria which the performance will be judged. So those are the following suggestions that Lynn has put into the table in order to improve the development of the tasks. The next step in designing a meaningful performance-based assessment would be developing scoring schemes. So In developing scoring schemes or in scoring, there are different useful ways to record assessment of students' performance. So there are also varieties of tools which can be used for assessment depending on the nature of the assessment or the nature of the performance. First, we have rubrics as an assessment tool. So rubrics nowadays have been widely used as an assessment tool in various disciplines, most specifically or especially in the field of education. So a rubric used to score students' responses to performance assessment has at minimum three important features. So a rubrics has to have these following features. One, evaluative criteria. These are the factors that used to be determined to be used in determining the quality of a student's response. We have number 2, descriptions of qualitative differences for evaluating criteria. So for each evaluative criterion, a description must be supplied so qualitative distinctions in students' responses can be made using the criterion. And lastly, an indication of whether a holistic or analytic scoring approach is to be used. So the rubric must indicate whether the evaluative criteria are to be applied collectively in a form of holistic scoring or on criterion by criterion basis of the form of analytic scoring. So NITCO on 2011 suggested some questions which the teacher should address upon making rubrics. So what important criteria or learning targets do I need to assess? What are levels of development or achievement for each of these criteria and learning targets? Should I use holistic or analytical scoring rubrics? And so on and so forth. So analytic rubric requires the teachers to list and identify the major knowledge and skills which are critical in the development of process or product tasks. So this is an example of our analytic rubric. Meanwhile, this is the example of holistic rubric. So holistic rubric requires the teachers to make a judgment about the overall quality of each student's response. So next, we have the 3.3 rubric development. So Stevens and Levi's Introductions to Rubrics in 2005 enumerated the steps in developing rubric. Basically, rubrics are composed of task descriptions, scales, dimensions, and description of dimension. Task description involves the performance of the students. So scale is another composition of a rubric. So scale describes how well or poorly any given task has been performed and determine to what degree the student has met a criterion. So generally, it is used to describe the level of performance. Next, we have dimensions. Dimensions, this is a set of criteria which serves as a basis for evaluating students' output or performance. The dimension of rubric lays out the parts and how tasks are divided into its important components as basis for also scoring the students. And next, we have the description of dimensions. So dimensions should contain description of the level of performance, a standard of excellence accompanied by example. This allows both the teacher and the students to identify the level of expectation and what dimension should or must be given an emphasis. So last step or a guide in designing a meaningful performance-based assessment is the rating the performance. So this is the final step of performance-based assessment, determining the learning outcomes of the students. So the main objective of this is rating the performance is to be objective and consistent. Be sure also that the scoring system is feasible as well. In most of the classroom situations, the teacher is both the observer and the rater. So some common errors in rating should be avoided. So for example, personal bias and halo effect. Of course, in rating the performance, we should avoid personal bias and halo effect. So Macmillan in 2017 or on 2007 rather stated that personal bias results in several or three kinds of error. We have generosity error occurs when the teacher tends to give higher scores. Severity error results when the teachers use the low ended scale and underrate student performance, and the central tendency error in which students are rated in the middle. On the other hand, halo effect occurs when the teachers give general impression of the students according affects scores given on individual traits or performance. So that ends the chapter 4, the designing of meaningful performance-based assessment.